Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. As Kate just mentioned, I'm Kevin Leahy. I'm OneNorth's Senior Director of Content and Brand Strategy. And I'm very grateful and privileged to be able to talk to you today about the long game of brand strategy. Just a couple of quick disclosures up front. In this conversation, I talk about some past and present clients, including Google and Meta, who I worked with in my capacity at OneNorth and also at a previous agency. And I also talk a little bit about Mark Ritson, who is a marketing professor and Marketing Week columnist, whose mini MBA in brand strategy course I took, and who's actually inspired some of the material that you're going to see today. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone is well aware of that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, when we think about our job as marketers or brand strategists or wherever we sit in our particular organization, we all have jobs that require a lot of focus. And just speaking personally throughout the pandemic, I found focus to be in short supply at times. It always felt like there was some shiny new thing that was sort of pulling my attention away from what I needed to do. And sometimes it kind of, caught me unawares with new developments. So I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about what I experienced shortly after I turned 40, which was the advent of a new social network that I knew nothing about, which is something I guess I'm going to have to get used to in my advanced years. But way back in 2020, Clubhouse briefly rose to fame and ultimately reached a $4 billion valuation. You may remember this. It was the audio-only social network, and it was pretty hyped by both the marketing trades as well as the mainstream media. But ultimately, after a very brief sort of period of time, it sort of peaked and declined, and now it's scaled back quite a bit. So it kind of came and went and didn't leave that much of a trace in the culture. As we moved a little bit further into the pandemic, it felt like 2021 was just a year of Web 3.0, crypto, and NFTs. There were a couple of months, especially in the branding and marketing world, where it felt like NFTs were pretty inescapable, and they also commanded, of course, a bunch of mainstream media attention. And the question seemed to be, at least among thought leaders, it wasn't really a matter of whether or not your brand should use NFTs and really kind of get in on the ground floor of this, but exactly how you should. And of course, regrettably, as we all know, a lot of that sort of reached a peak over the course of the last year, and also has recently been declared that the NFT market is pretty much flat, if not in really bad decline right now. So again, just something that sort of grabbed all of our attention for a little while, and then tended to fizzle out. When moving on to 2022, of course, the big thing that we were all sort of urged to pay attention to here, I remember this headline kind of appearing in my inbox one day, this Forbes at the bottom here, why it's time for marketers to believe the metaverse hype. And it's true. I mean, the metaverse has some great use cases. McKinsey had a series of thought leadership pieces on it, benchmarking the opportunity at anywhere between like $6 and $13 trillion. But regrettably, this appears to be something where the jury is still out. But right now, at least, a lot of brands are sort of pulling back on their metaverse strategies. Some of them are still moving forward and experimenting, but it's really kind of an open question. With, of course, some media outlets going so far as to say that perhaps its time has come and gone already. So, if we think about what this hype cycle tends to look like and what tends to fuel it, typically it's inaugurated by some sort of technological advance, which then sees a high influx of capital, and then you have some media saturation that sort of captures the narrative and directs it all toward these topics that are already pulling all of this money and capital to themselves. And one thing that my boss, Kyle Peekna, has helpfully pointed out and really helped me crystallize my thinking on this. But in times of rapid change, new tactics tend to appear that harness these technologies, and then these tactics tend to command all the attention. And sometimes we can get a little bit backwards. We can start thinking tactics first instead of strategy first. And this doesn't even apply just to to major meta narratives or major news stories, whatever the one big thing is that year. If you take a look at just everyday tactical options, I think this is about 380 some different options for a CRM. Just kind of looking at a snapshot of what's available on the market right now. If you were to situate this within the larger, say, MarTech landscape, the MarTech 5000, which used to be the collection of sort of the 5,000 leading MarTech platforms in the market, is now a little bit above 11,000 solutions. So basically, we're essentially overwhelmed by all this choice. We're not really sure what it is that we should be paying attention to in these times of rapid technological change. And so the question becomes, how do we go ahead and identify what's really important and what we ought to go ahead and pay attention to? And that's really what I hope to talk about today. When I get into a situation like this, I tend to try to strip it back to basics. So what we're going to go ahead and examine is, let's think about what really requires our focus. What does the evidence suggest that we ought to do? And then finally, how do we go ahead and put it all together? Whether we are in marketing or brand strategy or brand management or CX. I think one of the things that really helps drive alignment within an organization or between organizations like agencies and clients is having a common frame of reference and having a common vocabulary. So I apologize for having to do this, but by the laws of branding presentations, I have to go ahead and do this. I have to define what a brand is. I'll keep it as short and painless as I can, but I think it's a really useful frame just to go ahead and share our terms and get on the same page with us. I tend to think of brand as being a memory, and some of this is influenced by the work of evidence-based marketing firms like the Ehrenberg Bass Institute out of the the University of Australia. They tend to frame up a model brand where it's an associative network of different memories. So if I think about a brand that's played a major role in my life this year, my family's life, it would be Disney, partly because during spring break this year, we all went on a nice vacation there. So when I think of Disney and I think about the associative network that's in my head, maybe I'm thinking, best family vacation. I'm also thinking about products in addition to experiences. Today's Tuesday. My 12-year-old will be waiting for me at home tonight, asking how soon we can go ahead and watch Ahsoka as soon as it drops tonight on Disney+. In that network of memories, though, are also distinctive brand assets. These can be characters, or these can be longtime pieces of intellectual property that are associated with the brand in my head. And also mixed up in that are just some general impressions in things I feel about the brand, whether or not I consciously think these things. It's more of just sort of a general gut feel that I get when I think about the brand and when I have consistent interactions with the brand. So those interactions are, like I said, these experiences and products, but they're also marketing communications. And so when this network of associations and memories built and sustained and refreshed by products and services or experiences in marketing communications, it can be said that you have a strong brand. So why is that good? Well, a brand is a really valuable intangible asset. Strong brands tend to beat the market by a significant margin. This is an analysis of a portfolio of brands from the Morgan Stanley Capital International Index from McKinsey from a couple years ago. You'll notice, however, of course, that it ends right at 2020. So, what happens to brands in times like we've had the last couple of years, where we have unprecedented events happening? Well, strong brands tend to be more resilient in bad times. What you're seeing here on the left is the weekly recovery rate based on the number of weeks to regain the pre-COVID-19 peak value after the lowest point, which was in March 2020. And then you can see that there's additional value that's been added after that peak recovery for brands that can be said to be strong. So Another big benefit of strong brands is that they reduce price sensitivity. And that's something that in our current inflationary environment is something that's potentially very attractive to brand managers. So, when you think about what people are willing to pay for a given product or service, it's influenced by their perceived value, right? So, especially for things like services, the quality of the product or service, of course, has an enormous and is the primary thing that goes ahead and convinces somebody the perceived value. But there's also branding and marketing activities, all of those experiences that form that associative network that can also raise the perceived value of your product or service. And that allows you to preserve margin and enables greater profitability. And the evidence for this comes from Kantar, their Brand Z Global Index. They've been tracking this for quite a few years in conjunction with Millward Brown and a couple of other brand valuation firms. But what you're seeing here is that if you divide brands according to their meaningfully distinctive or meaningfully different framework, the brands that are perceived as most different have the lowest price sensitivity. People are willing to pay more for famous, well-known brands that they perceive is different. So the question then becomes, how do we go ahead and start? How do we go ahead and increase that perceived value? How do we go ahead and do brand strategy in a world of endless choice, in a world of tons of little distractions, and in a world where tactics tend to be leading the way? Today, I want to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of brand strategy from the perspective of where I learned it. I learned it at VSA Partners, which was a great branding and design firm here in Chicago. I came up as a creative director, and then I was able to make the switch to strategy director at my next job, Pivot Design here, where I had to work on both brand and content. So I've always found it very helpful, and even in my career at One North, to take a really holistic look at this and to ground myself in, first and foremost, what is the customer's perspective or the client's perspective? Segmentation, taking a look at everyone that we could go ahead and reach, and of course, targeting. And what we're really trying to ask here is, who is our market? What do they care about? And where are they spending their time, their money, and their attention? So if there's really only one thing that you might take away from this presentation, there's one piece of advice I might be able to offer that was passed on to me that I feel has really borne out over the course of my career. It's that you really have to talk to your audience. Having that first party data is not only incredibly rich and incredibly important, pretty soon it's going to be an even better choice, because the death of cookies, going away, of course, next year, is going to force a lot of folks to reconnect with their audiences. But that's also a really big opportunity to go ahead and get to know them better, to understand their needs, their pain points, their preferences, and hear some of those answers directly from the source. And so when you're talking to customers, there's really two things that I'm always listening for, no matter what kind of conversation I'm having. The first of those things is I really want to understand what they love about working with my particular client. And if you listen carefully, they'll kind of give you the answers. And if you talk to enough of them, you're going to start to hear the same themes come up over and over again. So you might hear something like, I felt like, the client was really invested in long-term relationships. Or they might give you some really good content strategy tips. They might tell you how they, heard about the brand, then they went ahead and gathered some information from the website. They'll tell you about the role that thought leadership and content played in the customer journey. Sometimes they'll tell you what they really appreciate about a client. And, after you talk to, let's say, a dozen or so folks, you start to get a list of the same things that crop up again and again. And the second thing that I'm really listening for is I'm trying to figure out the long and winding honeybee pattern, from how they went from being a prospect who hadn't heard of my client to becoming a loyal and repeat customer. And that tends to look a little bit different from client to client, from market to market, and even from segment to segment. So it is important to talk to those folks and to really map those things. And when you have those things mapped, especially the journey, one of the nice things you can do is you can build your own custom funnel to track awareness. What I'm showing here on the left is that McKinsey consumer decision journey. This is the model of the funnel that One North tends to use with a lot of our clients. We have a lot of relationship-based businesses, and this is sort of custom made for that. But there's lots of other choices out there. I mean, this is sort of the epitome of all models are wrong, some models are useful. That honeybee pattern, like people don't literally go through a phase of like awareness and the discovery and consideration and conversion and loyalty. It really does look different, but it's a helpful model to think, from one end of the spectrum to the other. At some point, somebody had not heard of you, was totally unaware of you, and then at the other end of the spectrum, now they have somehow gone through that journey and they've become a client or a customer of yours. What does that look like? So one of the weaknesses, of course, of just doing that small group qualitative, those interview studies, is that you're kind of exposing yourself to sample bias, right? Well, the good news is this is kind of by intention. You kind of want to oversample folks who really do know the brand, because they're going to be able to give you insights that we just can't see from inside our organizations. I had a boss who used to say, you can't read the label from inside the pickle jar. And it took me a while to really understand what that meant, because I used to think, well, we can certainly do some Googling and we can make some strong inferences and we can look at what other people's customers are doing, but there really is no substitute for really talking to folks and getting those insights. So the good news is that once you've done that small group qualitative interview study, you can turn around and you can engage a consumer panel company like Ovation or YouGov, are just two that we've used so far this year. But there are many hundreds of them. Some of them specialize deeply in either B2B or B2C. Some of them specialize within particular industries or sectors. And what you can do is you can ask them to recruit a scientifically representative sample of potential clients or customers of yours who happens to match your segmentation and targeting. And what you can do is you can ask them a series of questions and walk them through the journey in a carefully constructed hierarchy. You can test unaided awareness and top of mind, 2 measures, with a single question. You can cue the category and you can ask them to name brands that come to mind. So for example, if I'm working with an airline client, I might have a question in the survey that says, consumer, when you think of major airlines, which options come to mind? And there's a series of boxes, and they can go ahead and type in whatever answer comes to mind. And that one answer gives you the top of mind, first answer. And it also gives you unaided awareness. In other words, without using any aids or prompts, they go ahead and they give you the answer. You can then round out your awareness score by actually showing your logo along with the logos of several of your competitors, randomized, of course, to avoid any ordering effect. And you can say, which of the following airline brands are you familiar with? Please check all that apply. And you can go ahead and have them check those, and then you can literally just walk down the funnel that you've constructed and come out at the other end with a strong idea of where you sit relative to competitors. So here, imagine if you're company one, you can go ahead and take a look and see, okay, great. I can see that of these 430 folks, we've got aided awareness among 29% of them. How is that? Well, compared to company 2, 4, 5, and we're doing pretty well. Company 3, of course, is really doing a great job. Maybe we can learn something from that. You can also measure your brand perceptions against competitors. So the things that you hear in those small group interviews, some of those quotes I showed, like investing deeply in relationships, or delivering strong thought leadership, or being able to customize solutions. Those are all things that you can test, and you can figure out. You might get something that says like, hey, we scored a 79 on like bringing the right solution for my needs. Like, that's pretty good. And if you do that in isolation, it does look good. But one of the benefits of being able to benchmark it against competitors is you can say, oh, actually 79 is kind of like at parity, or we're not doing that great compared to some of these competitors. I wonder if there's room for improvement there. So it just gives you a really nice, strong idea of where you stand. You can also build customer personas in journey maps based on those segments, and you can use them to inform decisions about the kinds of customer experiences you want to create. And if there's one thing I really want to emphasize about this, it's that these kinds of activities are not the sole province of brand strategy. So these artifacts, for example, were created by my colleague, Kat Collette. She's our Director of Customer Experience Strategy. And they're among the richest and the clearest I've seen, which is why I went ahead and I wanted to really show you guys today. UX and content strategy can also lead or contribute to personas and journey maps. And in our experience, we really get better results by combining diverse perspectives from within your organization. So whether you're a strategist who's working in an agency or whether you're a strategist within an organization, this is one of those group exercises where you really can get people in a room and have everyone sort of share what they learned in those interviews and their past experience, and really build some incredibly rich artifacts here. All right, so that covers off on the first part of this. So let's talk a little bit about the second part, positioning. How do we want to be perceived? What is our positioning? What's our intended brand image? Which basically boils down to, what do we want to stand for in the mind of our market? And what do we want to communicate? So there's a little bit of a balance that you have to strike here. And as we go on, you'll see that that's sort of a running theme of mine for this presentation. So if brand is a memory, to be memorable, you actually need to stand out. The things that we remember, the things that make an impression on us, right? But once that memory is built, you need to refresh a customer's memory so that they actually recognize you as you. And that means that you have to find a way to codify your identity and be consistent with it while still somehow making it fresh and distinctive, right? So how do you do that? Well, to take one example, I want to turn the clock back 50 years to an iconic brand that's still going really strong today, of course, which is BMW. So if we go way back to 1973, in the midst of an oil crisis, right? 1970s, you got the energy crisis, you've got political strife, the nation is entering a period of high inflation. So BMW launches the ultimate driving machine, as well as a new luxury car in the US, in that effort to go ahead and have that perceived increased value, right? So one of the things that's really super interesting, I think, to take a look at is if you go back and look at the original napkin sketch, basically from the agency that developed this. Ultimate Driving Machine is real tiny there. I'm so sorry, you probably can't see it on your screens, but it's real tiny there in the lower right-hand corner of the original sketch ad, which itself is pretty close to the actual ad that made it into market. So once they put this out there, then what you see from them is consistent and faithful execution. Really over a period of the next 50 years. And you'll see that the execution flexes depending on whether it's a newspaper ad or whether it's a print ad or whether it's a television commercial, because you have to go ahead and customize, by media and channel to take advantage of that particular vehicle's or channel's, expression. But you also see that you go ahead and make it fresh, and you can really keep it up with a new digital expression. So why are they trying to be consistent like this decade after decade? Why pick one positioning and stick to it? Well, it's because if brand is a memory, memories do tend to fade. Memories can even fade for distinctive things that we think we know extremely well. So if you go ahead and look in your wallet, I'm sure everyone there will go ahead and see a dollar bill. There's an exercise that Robert Epstein, he's a senior research psychologist at the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology, also the former editor of Psychology Today. He has an exercise that he likes to run through to illustrate the limits of memory and information processing. His whole theory is that your brain doesn't process information like a computer in the way that we think. There's no representation of a dollar just in our heads. So what he asks people to do is go up to the chalkboard or on a piece of paper and go ahead and draw me a dollar bill as best you can from memory. And he covers it up. And then he'll go ahead and take out a real dollar bill and ask them to go ahead and draw it again. And when they do, inevitably, the second version of the dollar bill is incredibly detailed and is much more detailed, obviously, than the original drawing, showing that even the things that we're super familiar with every single day really require some consistent application in order to make it stick in our memories. Even then, it starts to fade. It's another reason that messaging discipline is so critical. Why choose the ultimate driving machine and stick with it for decades? It's because the studies show that if you take a single message and you put that in a campaign, the retention and the recall is twice as high as if you try to go ahead and put a whole bunch of different messages into a campaign. So one of the key learnings from this is, for the leading brands in the world, is you have to really build that distinctive visual and verbal identity, right? And that takes investment. I mean, it does take a lot of effort. But the one thing that you have to watch out for is once you've built it, you can't just sort of sit back and assume that people are going to show up and take notice that they're going to come. I call this the field of dreams fallacy. So, it's not really enough to build it. You have to message it to the world. So how do you do that? And how about you think of, messaging that to the world? Well, of course, you have to go ahead and go after the customers who are in market today. But you also have to keep an eye on the future too. And that's because for most markets, only about 5% of your total addressable market is ready to buy today. The other 95% are out of market, and they're likely to stay out of market, not until they see a great piece of advertising or marketing or branding, but until they have a need that impels them to go ahead and search for, to go ahead and prompt their memory and say, I have a need for a certain thing, category, product, service. Which options come to mind? This is where measuring things like top of mind and awareness becomes so crucial, because in a world where you've got more than 11,000 choices for just one category of things, being top of mind, being in that consideration set, and being able to come to mind easily is a really crucial and valuable asset. So when we think about the split between this 5% that's in market and the 95% that's out of market, this comes from the B2B LinkedIn, the LinkedIn B2B Research Institute. And some of this work is based on the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, which I've mentioned previously. And the rest of it is based on the work of Les Binet and Peter Field, who came out with a seminal paper about 10 years ago called The Long and the Short of It, which was an update, of course, on their 2007 paper, Marketing in the Era of Effectiveness. And in it, this is, if I had to take a guess, this is probably the most famous chart in branding and marketing for the last 10 years, just because it lays out, again, a model that's wrong, but useful, at least in terms of figuring out how we ought to balance those two objectives of building a brand for tomorrow and generating future demand, but also capturing the demand that's in market today. What you see in that blue spike repeating pattern is short-term performance marketing activation. The spike up is when people turn the money on, and that relatively rapid decay is what happens when people turn the money off. And as you can see, you can get a brand uplift for a little while, but you can notice that in the model, it tends to plateau. However, if you take a look at the other one, the magenta stair step line, that represents brand building activation. So you'll notice here that, especially in the lower left quadrant, if you can see where it says short-term effects dominate in 6 months, you'll notice that it takes the better part of a year for brand building activities to really show up and deliver results. It's one of the reasons that, especially for the last 15 years, we've seen a big diversion away from brand building toward short-term performance marketing. So on a practical level, how should we think about the different kinds of messaging or advertising or tactics that align with long and short? Well, just to go ahead and stay with the BMW car theme, again here, trying to be distinctive, but also trying to keep it fresh, right? This advertisement is not trying to really persuade you of anything. It's just an emotional position, right? It's trying to tell you that this is a car that's going to be fun to drive. So this is pretty typical of brand building activities. The real function is to have a loosely targeted or even untargeted message and in assets that reach all potential buyers in an effort to stimulate future demand. I would actually argue that even a lowly Toyota Camry driver like myself, I am the target for this ad, because in a world where only the target market was shown and made aware of a product or service that was designed just for them, products that have some sort of cultural resonance, like luxury products and luxury cars, nobody else would have heard BMW if BMW didn't show them to ad, it didn't show ads to non-buyers like myself. However, I don't want to run down performance marketing because it's incredibly useful and it absolutely has its place. So if we think about performance marketing or brand activation, brand activation really works by taking the demand that your brand building activities have built up and then harvesting that and converting that demand into sales today. So if you kind of toggle between these two, you'll notice the difference here, big, visual, really more of a vibe, whereas this one is more about facts, right? So on the one hand, brand building, loosely targeted, emotional. This one is really about targeting that 5% of people who are ready to buy today. They already know that the car is fun to drive. They already know it's the ultimate driving machine. That work has been done over decades for them. But now we're going to go ahead and make a rational appeal to them. We're going to tell them you can lease this for only $279 a month. We're going to tell you that there's no waiting period in the hopes that that takes that demand that's been building potentially for years, and we're able to convert that into sales today. So when these two things work in harmony, you can get a really nice virtuous cycle going. But as I mentioned, one of the learnings in the last 15 years is that performance marketing kind of took over the world. And one big reason why is just the rise of digital marketing. It really saw a shift away from long-term brand building activities, and it redirected that money toward short-term performance activation. And one of the big reasons is, candidly, it's definitely easier to measure. And of course, in an era of accountability where we have to make sure that every marketing dollar is accounted for, it's really a lot easier, candidly, to show ROI for short-term performance marketing. One of the other things that's a really big benefit is Google Analytics, which by 2008, I think it reached something like 86% market share in terms of being used for attribution modeling on the internet. And so one of the challenges, though, is that the prepackaged attribution model that came with Google Analytics tended to overstate its contribution to sales. So what I mean by that is that anyone who happened to click on a search ad at any point in this 30-day period that's being examined here, the Google ad was credited with that. So we're not really sure if that's true or not, but somebody did want to go back and check that math. That somebody was Grace Kite, who's an econometrician. You're going to see some more research by her in this presentation. Those of you who went to the assembly may have seen some of her research in my colleague Ben Magnuson's talk about analytics and content. Dr. Kite went ahead and separated out the effect of what the ad was and unbundled it from all the other elements that could influence those sales: price, TV, weather. And what she found is that the actual effect was actually about a third of what was claimed. Also during this period, you had people raising the alarm about falling effectiveness in the era of rising short-termism. So what you see here in that dotted blue line that's rising, that is the rise of short-term performance marketing. You can see here that that green line is the decline of effectiveness. Notice that it peaks around 2008. Again, that's just sort of the year that digital marketing kind of starts to eat the internet. However, there is some good news on the horizon. That same econometrician, Grace Kite, has gone back and looked at an econometric analysis of a database of campaigns from around the world and found that effectiveness has started to go ahead and climb upwards in the last couple of years. So I mentioned before that you can get stuck in that performance plateau. So the question becomes, how do you get off of it? Well, this analysis was done by Tom Roach, and again, in partnership with Grace Kite. And what you can see here is, if you squint a little bit, you can go back and see the long and the short of it here. You can see that the short-term performance marketing gets you to a certain point, but then you need that brand building staircase or that bump period in order to go ahead and get you off that plateau and return you to profitable growth. So this is from about a year ago. This is relatively new data, and the evidence for for brand building's effectiveness has actually gotten a couple of nice new bumps in the last year. So System 1 which is a great ad testing firm. They basically show people ads and they have them rate them according to this 5-star system here. One of the things that they do is they can separate out the effects of brand building on sales. So even though somebody might be just trying to go ahead and do a loosely targeted, purely emotional, creative execution, not really worry about giving somebody a rational message, the good news is that it can also convert to sales growth. And this is from, I think, earlier this year. And those findings were reconfirmed by another firm called Analytic Partners, which has published a lot of thought leadership over the last 10 years about marketing effectiveness. And they found something similar. They found that a 72% increase in brand spending had a proportionate 76% increase in profit, but it also went ahead and had performance marketing impacts as well. So, the evidence seems to suggest that, so far at least, that spending on brand building activities, you can get 2 for 1 in some cases. So obviously, the question becomes, is the converse true? And so far, I'm going to go ahead and say that the evidence to date suggests sort of a qualified no. It doesn't seem like overspending on performance marketing has brand building effects. I want to say though that it's not that black and white. What tends to happen though is that folks who overspend on that performance marketing get stuck on that performance plateau. And then it requires a period of brand building in order to go ahead and get you off the plateau and get back to growth. So what else should we do now that we've talked about the long and the short of it and what kinds of messages we want to go ahead and create, being distinctive and differentiated, looking like ourselves, but also keeping it fresh? One of the things that can help drive ROI is to take your same budget and instead of putting it in one platform, you can spread it across a number of different channels and you'll see synergistic effects. You'll see that some channels reinforce each other. This evidence comes from a paper about 7 years ago from the Journal of Advertising Research. It got some pretty wide acclaim back then. The good news is it's also been reconfirmed by more recent research done between Analytic Partners and in Think with Google. I believe this is from earlier in this year. So you can see that there are specific channels that tend to work well together. For instance here, TV and online video tend to go ahead and have great synergistic effects. Out of home and online video, having a billboard and then actually showing an online video also tend to have really nice, strong synergistic effects along with TV and paid search here. One thing that's not on this in terms of channels, I think this is from 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, this channel wasn't really as big a thing, but retail media has recently had a real day in the sun this year. If you subscribe to the Worldwide Advertising Research Council, WARC, or any other number of industry traded publications, you may have seen some information about retail media and the rise. Those same synergies appear to be present in retail media, and they appear to be working even for like search and for display ads. So this is an analysis of Amazon marketing efforts on Amazon and non-Amazon sales. And you can see that paid Amazon display has an impact as well as paid Amazon search. They have impact on non-Amazon sales. So somebody sees your ad in Amazon, buys it from you somewhere else. Again, an important thing for folks in the retail industry. So what else are we talking about? Let's think about budgeting. How much is all of this going to cost? This is where I want to mention that One North is not a media agency. And so a lot of the recommendations I'm going to put in this section are essentially boiling down to spend money not with us. So apologies to my colleagues at One North, but this is the right advice, I think. And so one of the pieces on budgeting, I think that's gotten a lot of attention the last year, which I have a slight bias, of course. I took a mini MBA course from him, is Mark Ritson, professor at Marketing Week, has a recipe for budgeting that he calls his triple cooked chips, based on the fact that if you cook French fries or chips 3 times in a certain way, apparently it produces just world-class chips. And so his recipe here for that budget is to go ahead and try and budget for 10% of revenues, which I know can be an absolutely eye-watering number, and it is a non-starter for some industries, and that's okay. But what is this based on? Where does the evidence from this come from? So it comes from Magic Numbers' meta-analysis of a database of ARC, the Advertising Research Council, Paul Dyson's budget optimizations, and a Nielsen study from last year that looked at 150,000 cases worldwide. Go ahead and calculate ROI and what percentage of revenues is best for that. Long and shorthand frying. So again, this is based on that Binet and Field, the split between long-term brand building and short-term activation. A 60-40 split is a pretty good rule of thumb, but it's going to be different for every industry, and it's going to be different for every client. And also, it might not be politically feasible, candidly, to tell your CFO, I need 60% of this budget to go to something that won't prove, that I can't quite prove attribution for maybe up to a year. And the other thing is, when you measure that, you have to deep fry with 2 timers. So again, what metrics you choose to measure by are going to be really dependent on the objectives that you choose. But in general, you want to measure the long with brand tracking, and you want to measure the short with ROI, and actually let the ROI from your short term pay for the investment in the long term. So what happens if you truly have no money? How do you go ahead and defend against this? Is it all just down to budget? Is it all just down to that? And the good news is no. So Paul Dyson, who's one of the gentlemen I just mentioned in the triple cooked chips recipe, he's been putting out some research publications, first in 2006, again in 2014, and now he's back this year with multipliers on advertising profitability. And the really good news here is that creativity has been in the second position for all 3 of those reports. So for the last 17 years, and it appears that the effect of creativity on profitability has gone up a little bit over time. I think in 2006 it was 11, same with 2014, and now it's up to 12. Of course, the biggest thing remains brand size, but we can't all be big, but we all can take creative risks and be a little bit more daring. So how do we advocate for a budget, or at least keep what we have off the chopping block? As we mentioned, we're in an inflationary environment right now. Macroeconomic waters are getting a little bit choppy. So what research is out there to help us make that case? Well, there is some really good news coming out of BCG. They did a recent brand impact analysis. This is from July of last year. I think the data set published earlier this year. One of the things that they found consistently is that cutting brand marketing in a downturn causes long-term damage. So you get weaker funnel conversion. You can see lower market share. See market share declines from cutting spending, lower sales growth, and even lower shareholder return. Conversely, though, there are some people who zig when everyone else is zagging. They call these advanced marketers, and they tend to see downturns as an opportunity to double down on what's working. And this can be really smart. You can figure out that in an environment where everyone else is cutting and they're pulling back, there's a potential for media to be cheaper and for you to be able to grab a larger share of voice without paying a premium for it. And so, what other evidence exists though besides this this year-long case study from BCG? Well, the good news is that we have about a century of evidence on this. So this comes from a Marketing Week summary that came out earlier this year about Roland Vale, a Harvard-trained economist, who took a look at 3 different cohorts of companies. Companies who did no advertising during a depression, which represents the yellow line. Companies who decreased their advertising, which aligns with BCG's findings. And then companies that sort of align to that advanced marketers persona that BCG just talked about, that green line. They doubled down, increased their spend, and actually saw it go up. This has been reconfirmed over the years. I think this chart comes from Alex Beal and Stephen King, advertising during a recession about 20 years ago. They reconfirmed that same pattern in a meta-analysis of studies decade after decade. Companies that cut advertising by 20% or more in tough times, they suffer long-term damage and a long-term drop in sales. But companies who double down and increase their budgets can see dramatic increase in sales and even grow market share. However, not everyone agrees. Again, Grace Kite from Magic Numbers talks about the fact that not all brands should maintain ad spend during a recession. And she especially calls out, you know, kind of a stark advice here. In extreme cases, what she calls victim businesses may not survive to see the payback from that investment. So again, if brand building takes a little bit longer to show up in terms of profitability in the numbers, there is a risk if you're in a really, really shaky macroeconomic situation in brand building. And so in those cases, it absolutely makes sense to be conservative with all of this. So I've mentioned share of voice a couple times as a key concept here. And we just went through some charts that show if you tend to overspend, you tend to grow. If you cut, you tend to shrink. This is known colloquially as the share of voice rule. And this particular data set comes from the long and the short of it in partnership with the LinkedIn B2B Research Institute. I believe the person who first formalized this was John Philip Jones in the Harvard Business Review back around the early 1990s. Really did a really deep analysis to show that you achieve equilibrium between share of market and share of voice. In other words, share of voice is just the total, your percentage of the total amount of media spend in a given category, and it tends to correlate with market share. For companies that overspend, the term for that is ESOV, excess share of voice. And that can also be a really powerful growth lever. And these were findings that first came to prominence in B2C for consumer brands. And the reaction, candidly, among the B2B community was mostly, well, that's fine for for selling toothpaste or for selling consumer products, but we're services category, we're a high involvement purchase, we're a luxury purchase. Only procurement really cares about what we're doing. But funny enough, what the data appears to suggest is that service categories are even more sensitive to retail and fast-moving consumer goods, to this share of voice lever. So this dovetails exactly with what we were just talking about in not cutting your marketing spend in a recession. If everyone else is pulling back, that makes it easier for you to go ahead and grab additional share. So is it that straightforward? No, there's people who disagree, and we should really listen to those voices because, again, all of this is based on probabilities. All this is based on a dynamic real-time experiment, right? So, the world is not static. All of these things change and evolve, and so we should take it seriously when three of the leading voices in marketing effectiveness say that excess share of voice is broken. So from left to right, that's Peter Field of Bennett & Field, who I've just shown you a bunch of his charts. Karen Nelson Field, who is a researcher and has some great findings on attention, no relation to Peter Field. And finally, Orlando Wood. Forgive me, I just noticed that we're coming up at the end, so I'm going to go ahead and speed it up a little bit. Orlando Wood of System 1, whose brand building achieves performance marketing effects we just walked through. So long story short, the digital media landscape has created some fragmentation that's making it very challenging to measure share of voice. This comes from Peter Field. Karen Nelson Field's contribution to this is to go ahead and look at real-time attention tracking studies. And what she's found is that different media channels produce different levels of attention, and that modern digital channels tend to build in more distraction for people than previous traditional channels like television, radio, and newspapers, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you're on a device that's built to scroll, distraction and attention are obvious dangers, right? And then finally, Orlando Wood's contribution to this is really to look at what's happening in creatives. What sort of techniques are we using? We've moved away from more effective techniques like drama, where you have characters with agency, and we've gone toward what's there on the bottom, less effective, flatness, voiceover, words on a screen over stock images. And these all have knock-on effects to effectiveness. So where do they agree, though, and where do they agree with everyone else who we've talked about so far? Problem is fixable. They do believe that brand building is critical to fixing that problem, and that short-termism threatens effectiveness. So I want to go ahead and leave a little bit of time for questions if we have it. So I'm going to get to objectives here. So let's talk a little bit about how to think about objectives, which of course ultimately depend on your business strategy. But the research does have some good suggestions. So let's go ahead and talk about what measurable changes we're working toward. So we've talked a little bit about the net and field. This also comes from the long and the short of it. And it suggests that if you try and go ahead and target the whole market rather than just targeting new customers or existing customers, if you go for reach, you're going to have a lot more efficiency. Not only that, but if you reach broadly, you're also going to have stronger business effects, things like higher profitability. Another way to set objectives, though, this is sort of like a good context for setting objectives. Remember that survey that we talked about before? You can actually use that to set your objectives. So, number one, let's go ahead and take a look at that funnel data. So imagine that you're company one. Maybe you're going to go ahead and you're going to choose as your objective, increase aided awareness from, let's say, 29 to 40%. And I'm going to pick that number because you can see that company two, you're already at parity with them in terms of awareness. Company three, though, is climbing up the leaderboards there. So we want to go ahead and see if we can make inroads on company three. So that might be one of our objectives. Secondly, let's go ahead and go for a bottom of the funnel objective. We can see here from looking at other companies in this study that the conversion rate from consideration to choice is a little better than 50% for company two and right on 50% for company three. Whereas for company one, it's lagging a little bit, right? It would be at 6.5% or so if it were at parity with competitors. Let's see if we can direct some short-term performance marketing promotional tactics in order to go ahead and get that from 5 to 7%. You might also look at your brand perceptions, and you might decide, we really need to go ahead and have a perceptual objective here. It looks like company one is lagging in terms of delivering great business value for the money. So let's see if we can go ahead and increase that perception of value to at least parity with our other competitor. And then finally, we can see here that our content marketing is really doing a great job for us in terms of delivering thought leadership. We're getting credit for that. We want to make sure that we don't sacrifice any equity there. So let's make sure that we maintain or maybe even double down on quality content marketing. Again, depending on your other objectives, your budget, and your industry and your company. So if you put that all together, like what does that look like if you were to just sketch it out on a napkin? You might go ahead and look at your target segments, right? So let's say that you're going to target the C-suite, decision influencers, as well as the whole market. You might have objectives aligned to each one of those targets. You might put budget against it, and then talk about measures. So for things like awareness, where it's the top of the funnel objective, you're going to go ahead and look at your annual survey. You're going to go ahead and look at share of search, organic traffic. You might go ahead and look at financial metrics like reduced cost to acquire a customer. And ultimately, you're going to look for market share growth, right? So that's going to be that long-term, going to show up a little bit later after you do the investment. For that second objective, drive preference from 5 to 7%, that's a bottom of the funnel objective. That can be straight up ROI. And so what does this look like after you set this and do it for a couple of years? Well, the payoff is that if you can do this and hold the wheel, the long-term investments compound over time. So you'll see here the one thing that really drops off. See that ESOP efficiency on the right? What that's showing, and this is my interpretation of the data, so quote me or don't, but that ESOP efficiency drop, to me, that's competitors getting wise to what you're doing and they're matching your spend, or they're trying to go ahead and catch up. But your first mover advantage has secured a durable lead in the number of very large business effects and profitability. So how do we put this all together? How do we go ahead and refocus on what's really important here? Again, whenever we get into these situations where there's overwhelming choice and rapid technological change, we can go ahead and we can stop the tactics tail from wagging the strategy dog by focusing on the basics. Whether you're segmenting and targeting, or whether you're whole market targeting, sophisticated mass marketing, talk to your customers about their needs and base your strategy on real data. If you remember anything else, brand is a memory, and memories are built by emotion. It builds and refreshes memory structures, and that takes time and it takes investment. You don't want to fall prey to the field of dreams fallacy by just assuming people's interest and assuming people will notice and remember you. You have to earn it. You have to earn it with that creativity in some creative risk taking there. And then finally, I would encourage you all to think holistically about your marketing activities. You can balance long and short by letting ROI from activation pay for that investment in brand. You should take advantage of those channel synergies. You should figure out which ones are going to be right for you. And you can ask your media agency about their perspective on attention. At every point in this process, you want to go ahead and try and unite these things together and really take a look at them in one single picture. So as a final thought, I would just say, experiment, take some creative risks, and perhaps most importantly, keep an open mind, because no one's figured all of this out. You can see that there's disagreements about people, on smaller matters, but there are some real areas of encouraging consensus. But there's still a ton to learn. So thank you all for your time and attention today. I know that we have perhaps 3 minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to my colleagues now to see if there's any questions we have a chance to answer.